image they would attempt to replicate in the construction of their new city, Tenochtitlan. Taking on the challenge would be an Aztec leader named Acamapichtli. In 1376, he embarked on an ambitious plan to engineer an advanced city at Tenochtitlan. But there was a problem.
The swampy islands that they took over needed a lot of work. When they started to build anything, it would begin to subside.
There was simply no foundation on which to build. The Aztec solution would revolutionize the architecture of the Americas. They began by anchoring their buildings deep in the ground using a system of pilings made from wood. Workers cut stakes into 30-foot lengths, 3 to 4 inches wide. These were driven into the soft ground to make a foundation. The pilings were often surrounded with volcanic stone to add strength. Masons and bricklayers could then build walls on top of this base with confidence.
They have found wooden pylons to hold the foundations of the pyramids. The fact that it didn't sink or the fact that it didn't just topple, I think that's a major feat of engineering.
Tenochtitlan was an island city, but the lakes surrounding it were very shallow, sometimes only 7 feet deep. The whole thing looked like a giant metroplex floating on a pond. Originally, the only way to get from this floating city to the mainland was by boat. But the Aztecs eventually devised a series of causeways, sometimes 45 feet wide, that would connect their floating city to the mainland provinces. The causeway was supported by strong wooden pilings, the same pilings that supported their temples and other buildings. Thousands of these pilings had to be driven deep into the lake bed, and this presented a logistical challenge that could only be met by a strong, skilled labor force and the best of Mesoamerica's engineers.
To build a causeway, 2 lines of stakes were laid out. Then the space between them was filled with stones and earth until it reached several feet above the water level. This allowed the road to support enormous weight.
These causeways were built very straight, they were very wide, with bridges that would open up that connected the city to the north, to the west, and to the south.
The roads enabled the Aztecs to transport larger, heavier materials for building. But this presented a new challenge.
There were no beasts of burden in Mesoamerica, so everything had to be done with humans. No carts, no wheel.
Small loads would be carried on the back with a rope hung from the forehead. Large items like stone blocks or sculptures for a temple would be dragged by huge numbers of men pulling ropes, possibly using logs as rollers. Legend has it one stone bound for a temple required a force of 50,000 men to drag it from the mountains on the mainland across the causeway and into the city. The causeways would also present the Aztecs with a new way to get fresh water to Tenochtitlan. In the past, the Aztecs had transported water in canoes from the shore. But a huge boom in the city's population meant they needed a higher-tech solution to keep up with demand.
They wanted to use water from the springs on the mainland, and so they wanted to build an aqueduct.
But the springs were under control of the dominant tribe in the region, the ruthless Tepanecs.
The Tepanecs were the controllers or the dominators of all the valley. They had a very strong empire. So they were the lords of the valley. So the Aztecs were tributary subjects to them.
As the Aztec population grew, tensions with the Tepanecs began to simmer. Now the Aztecs decided to issue an ultimatum that could change the balance of power in the region.
The people of Tenochtitlan not only demanded that the Tepanecs give them the water, but also demanded that they help construct the aqueduct.
The Tepanecs' answer was swift and brutal. The Tepanec king, Maxtla, sent assassins who murdered the reigning Aztec leader in cold blood. This was the final straw. After decades of domination, the Aztecs would finally make their move and wage war against their ruthless overlords. And they would launch a series of wildly ambitious building projects around their growing island city that would earn them a reputation as the greatest engineers of the Americas.
The founding tribe of the Aztecs called themselves the Mexica. The country of Mexico gets its name from this tribe.
It is 1428, and the Aztecs have declared war on their overlords, a tribe called the Tepanecs. But to defeat the Tepanecs, they would need a little help from their neighbors. The Aztecs approached the nearby city-state of Texcoco. There, a decisive leader was on the rise. His name was Nezahualcóyotl, and his domineering leadership would be instrumental in forging the Aztec Empire. With Nezahualcóyotl at their side, the Aztec underdogs would go for the jugular. They launched an all-out attack on the Tepanec capital. After a siege of more than 100 days, they broke through Tepanec defenses and slaughtered their oppressors. After capturing the Tepanec king, Maxtla, King Nezahualcóyotl personally cut out his heart and sprinkled his blood into the waters of Lake Texcoco. Suddenly, the tables had turned.
That is the exact moment of the beginning of the empire, and the Aztecs became the leaders of the Valley of Mexico.
After conquering the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs could now turn their attention to bringing clean water to their growing city. Remarkably, the Aztecs would independently design and build something that only a few world empires would master: the aqueduct. The aqueduct actually had two channels, each about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide. One would be cleaned and maintained, while the other was being used so the water flow was never interrupted. The twin-tube aqueduct ran for 3 miles from the mainland to the center of the island city. In town, water streamed into public fountains and reservoirs, and was distributed to the public in large clay jars or by canoe.
In comparison to the Europeans, the Aztec were a very clean people. We know that the Aztec emperor bathed twice a day. So in terms of hygiene, the Aztec people was much more advanced than the Europeans.
While the Aztec nobles were bathing in luxury, at this time in Europe, plague caused by unsanitary conditions was killing millions. King Nezahualcóyotl's own bath was one of the most unique in the Americas. It was fed by a sophisticated aqueduct system that also brought running water to his palace grounds.
Behind me is the hill of Tetzcoatzinco. And on this hill, Nezahualcóyotl built a fantastic pleasure palace. And around this palace, a virtual botanical garden filled with all of the exotic flowers of Mesoamerica. Nezahualcóyotl brought water from the Sierra Nevada mountains all the way down to here, into this hill, to his palace, just to water his plants.
To install an aqueduct there, Nezahualcóyotl had to fill a huge gorge between Tetzcoatzinco and the next hill. As the water arrived at the first hill, it gathered in small pools built to control the speed of the flow before it reached the aqueduct. After crossing the aqueduct, the water ran in a circuit around Tetzcoatzinco Hill, spilling off over the sides in rock-cut waterfalls to water the gardens. It ended up in a nearly perfectly round rock-cut pool called the King's Bath.
And from here, he could look upon his domain of Texcoco, and he could look down at the botanical gardens that he was watering with his fantastic aqueducts. It is indeed a bath fit for a king.
By the mid-15th century, with their empire on the rise, it was time for the Aztecs to choose a sovereign leader. He was called Moctezuma, and he would be the first of 2 emperors with this now famous name. Moctezuma's first order of business was to extend the empire's borders. The Aztecs captured city-states southward to the valley of Oaxaca, westward to the Pacific, and east toward the Gulf of Mexico. By 1449, the empire contained as many as 15 million people. In the short span of 100 years, the Aztecs accomplished the impossible. They had toppled the Mesoamerican world order. But while the Aztecs dominated militarily, their island city was vulnerable to a different kind of enemy. Like New Orleans, Tenochtitlan was constantly doing battle with water. And one of Moctezuma's first projects was to protect his city from the deluge of water surrounding it.
This is what is left of Lake Xochimilco, in the southern part of Mexico City, in Aztec times, the city of Tenochtitlan. This lake, like the other 4 lakes that surrounded the city, were spring-fed. Thus, there were no rivers or streams into which it could drain. And if it rained hard enough, the water would rise up and sweep over the land and into the city itself. And this is exactly what happened in the mid-1400s when a flood of catastrophic proportions swept into Tenochtitlan. The city and the empire it commanded were almost completely destroyed, and the Aztec civilization had to once again rely upon the genius of its engineers, and one engineer in particular.
Moctezuma enlisted the help of his old ally Nezahualcóyotl to protect the city he was rebuilding from the lake. Nezahualcóyotl would design a solution that would make him the greatest engineer on the continent. His plan was to create a safe zone around the city with a huge dike that would protect Tenochtitlan and its inhabitants. It was designed to be larger than any earthwork anywhere in the Americas at the time, running for 10 miles just east of the city from the southern edge of the lake across to the north. The walls were a wickerwork construction made of sticks, reeds, stone, and earth. Since the lake was shallow, the dike was only about 12 feet in height, but some 27 feet wide. Nezahualcóyotl fitted the dike with sluice gates, most likely wooden doors that would be raised or lowered to control the water level behind it. The dike also served another purpose. It protected their water supply.
It was important to build some sort of protective mechanism to keep salt water out of the freshwater western part of the lake.
An army marches on its stomach. So said Napoleon. Now, an ample food supply for civilians is a no-brainer in the critical development of any civilization. But the Aztecs perfected a unique method, not only to provide a substantial food supply for its civilian populace, but to fuel the military expansion of its empire.
This revolutionary engineering was called chinampas, a system that allowed them to literally create new land to farm and to live on.
If you're going to have a city of any size, you have to provide room for them. And so what they did was build up these chinampas in the lake bed.
Basically, a chinampa is an artificial island built in the lake.
They looked like narrow football fields, about 300 feet long by about 30 feet wide. A chinampa was built by weaving a web of sticks floating in the water and piling reeds on top of them. Mud was then scraped from the lake bottom and piled atop the reeds to form the chinampa. It took 4 to 6 men 8 days to build the average chinampa. They were connected to the city by massive navigational canals that would take thousands of men months to build.
A chinampa like this one could produce up to 7 crops a year, whereas a farm on the mainland could yield 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 at the most. As a crop was ready to harvest on a chinampa, seedlings from another would be sprouting out of mud that would be spread on a boat adjacent to the chinampa. Then when the seedlings were ready, they'd be transported to the chinampa, and this cycle would be repeated over and over and over again on hundreds and then thousands of chinampas. Now, it was this technology that transformed Tenochtitlan from just another tribal town in the 14th century to a dominant and thriving city-state.
With their city's infrastructure in place and vast lands under their control, the Aztecs would push the boundaries of their empire further than ever before. They'd create a far-flung network of roads, Aztec superhighways,